Today is Thursday, Parashat Toledot. We'll learn now the Halacha Pesuka from Chok Israel for today. Nashim va'avadim uktanim peturim mitalmud Torah. Aval katan aviv chayav lelamedo Torah. Women, avadim, they used to have slaves at the time, uktanim, those who are too young, children, are exempt from learning Torah. However, a father is obligated to teach his son Torah. In other words, the obligation is not on the child himself, but rather on the father to make sure that his son is taught Torah. Shne'emar, like the pasuk says, "V'nidmadtem otam ed benechem ledaber bam." You have the obligation to teach your children to speak words of Torah. In other words, to teach him Torah. Ve'en ha'isha chayavet lelamed et bena, shekol hachayav lilmod chayav lelamed. And a woman, the mother, is not obligated in the same way as the father to teach his son Torah, because only a person who's obligated to learn has the obligation to teach Torah. Of course, ladies should also learn halachot. They should learn also certain things that would be applicable to them, and there is no problem with women learning various aspects of the Torah. It's just that here, in terms of the obligation to be metzuveh, to dedicate time to Torah, is a man, he has that obligation even more than a lady. The same way that a person is obligated to teach his son, he has also the obligation to teach his grandson. So, in other words, with the tuition, the Jewish day schools being so up there, if you have grandchildren, you also have the obligation. It's just not your children that you have the obligation to make sure they get Torah education. You have also the obligation for your grandchildren to learn Torah. And therefore, if they need support for that, then you should do that. The pasuk says to teach your sons and the sons of your sons. Not just the obligation to teach your children and your grandchildren, but also a chacham, a person who's a learned, a Torah scholar, a learned person, has the obligation to teach students even though they're not his children. Like the pasuk says, your children also can refer to your students. Because the students are called also your children. So if that's the obligation you have as a person who's learned to teach even other people who are not related to as your children or grandchildren, anybody that you're able to teach, you have the obligation. Then why is it mentioned specifically your son and your grandson? To give us a priority. Priority is first your son. After your son, your grandson. After your grandson, other people that you're able to teach. So if you have only, let's say, a certain amount of time that you can dedicate to teaching, you give preference to your son, then to your grandson, then to other people. And you're obligated, even if it costs money, to hire a teacher, a Rabbi, to teach your son, or to send him to Jewish day school. It's not just you only teaching, but also to hire or to pay tuition for your children and grandchildren. But to teach other people who are not your sons or your grandsons, you don't have the obligation. Only if you can teach them for free. In other words, you don't have the obligation to spend money to cover the tuition costs of other people. But if you're able to do it as a chesed, of course it's nice. But it's not the same obligation as the obligation to teach Torah. Mish elo limedo aviv. What about a person whose father did not teach him Torah? Chayav lelamed et atzmo ksheyakir. Then the person has the obligation to teach himself. In other words, to join classes of Torah. Even though his father did not send him to a Jewish day school and he grew up, he's an adult now, he has the obligation to join classes of Torah and to learn. You have to learn Torah and you fulfill the Torah. First you have to learn in order to be able to do, in order to know how to carry out mitzvot, you have to learn. Because learning will bring you to practice. But if you practice without learning, it's not the same. It's not going to bring you to know more just because you practice. Of course, doing mitzvot in itself is a great thing, but invest time in learning so that you'll know how to do the mitzvot. What about he wants to learn Torah, but he has a son also that needs to learn? Hu kodem livno. He would take precedence over his son. In other words, he can either spend the money to teach him himself, or to join a class, or to teach his son. He would take precedence. Because if he hasn't learned enough, he should learn. Here comes into play a certain concept where people feel, now that they send their kids to Jewish day schools, that's it, they're exempt from learning Torah. Look, this is what I'm doing. No, you also have the obligation to learn by use, making sure that your children learn Torah. It doesn't exempt you from learning Torah yourself. What about if his son was very sharp-minded, he was able to learn even better than the father? Then the son would take precedence. Even though his son would have precedence over him, himself, lo yibatel, he should never release himself of the obligation to learn Torah. The same way that he has an obligation to teach his son, he has also the obligation to learn himself. Baruch Adonai le'olam, amen ve'amen.